Welcome to the Futurati podcast. Any member of the Futurati is somebody who believes in the power of the future. We know there's a better world ahead, and we indeed have the power to make it so. In our podcast, we talk to the best minds in the world about the most urgent problems facing mankind today, and we hope you learn as much from them as we do. I'm Thomas Fry, a professional futurist and keynote speaker.
And I'm Trent Fowler, a machine learning engineer and author. Thank you for joining us. Good evening, everyone, and thank you for listening to the Futurati podcast. Tonight, we're joined by Gary Rockis. Over the past several years, Mr. Rockis has been highly successful in providing leadership in collaborative efforts among business, industry, and education. He is the recipient of numerous national and state awards and has written 3 textbooks. Much of his recent work is focused on the Internet of Things and smart homes. If you enjoyed this interview, please don't forget to like the episode and subscribe on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts. And don't forget to check out our website, futuratipodcast.com. Hey guys, just one more note before we get to our interview with Gary. In this conversation, we wound up having internet connectivity issues, and so there are a number of places where Gary breaks up a little bit, or you might notice a gap in the audio, and we've done our best to scrub those out, but there's only so much you can do with this. I felt like the interview still contained a lot of great information. It wasn't so mangled that it wouldn't be useful, and so we put it out anyways. I hope it's not too big a nuisance, and I hope you get as much out of it as I did. Thanks. Gary, thanks so much for coming on the show.
I'm glad to be here.
Let's hear a little bit about your background, your interests, and what brought you to working on the problems that you're working on.
Well, I've always been interested in science as a kid. I was in school about the time that Sputnik came about, and I got real interested in rockets. In fact, I met Wernher von Braun, and from that point on, started building rockets and following that career. And I thought I was going to be an aeronautical engineer until I realized that school was going to be expensive. So I got a teacher scholarship and majored in history, and then walked across campus one day and found out they had a thing called technology. And at that point, I changed majors and went into teacher education, teaching technology. And that ended up being kind of a general shop and general activities that traditionally were in the shop. But it was also the age when vocational education really meant something.
Right.
And Illinois was building a whole series of vocational centers. And I was chosen to move over to the vocational electronics program, which I felt very uncomfortable with. And it wasn't until I met my advisory committee and they said, look, we know you're a good teacher. Do you want to teach what really matters? And I said, of course I do. And they said, well, then we'll show you. And I spent that next year going with them into the plants, looking at their equipment, looking at what they were doing. And they said, if you teach these things, we will hire your kids. So I started building all these trainers, which I thought everybody did, and ended up being nationally recognized as something really quite unique, because I was back then in 1970, I had kids working on 220 volt 3-phase controls, had safety in place. Mm-hmm. And that evolved into writing, because I got national reputation and the publisher approached me. I took a year off to write a book, build a house, and we also adopted a baby. So it was an interesting 1976 to say
no kidding.
The least. From there, I taught for 7 years with the equipment that I had bought from various salespeople, and the company that I bought the with us. And this was all these vocational centers. And I said, sure, I'll try that. So I did, and I sold about $300,000 worth of equipment, feeling pretty good. I was going back to teaching, and I said, okay, pay me. And they said, we're bankrupt.
Oh, no.
Don't have any money. I said, yeah, but I sold $300,000 worth of equipment. It's all coming due here in September. Well, we won't be in business to collect it. So I went to my banker, put up my house that I just built, borrowed $5,000, and converted it into a fairly successful business in 4 states, selling technology education to schools the equipment that I had bought and developed. So that evolved into a 35-year sales career, and in turn started writing books about what technology was evolving. At one point in the 70s, late 70s, early 80s, we were asked to be at the Museum of Science and Industry and on the Saturday Scholar. And we went in there with the first tabletop robot, the first tabletop CNC, and the first CAD station. And I was talking about, sometime in the future, next 20 to 30 years, you're going to see this as part of industrial automation. And this is what our plants and activities will be about. Well, it was a little bit of a, yeah, right. And today, that's exactly what it is. 12 years ago, I was involved at the museum, and we actually designed an industrial automation system, which is operating there. And a student or a parent or whatever can go in there and actually manufacture automated system. So the whole idea is I've been involved in technology and education for almost 40 years and really enjoy it.
That's pretty remarkable. I have a number of things that I want to follow up with you on. First, just to take a kind of broad perspective, given that you fell in love with technology with the launch of Sputnik, you pursued aeronautical engineering, wound up teaching, wound up building several companies around technology. You've seen the long arc over the past 40 years of technological development. Do you have any big picture takeaways from that? Do you have any principles you'd want to impart to somebody like myself who's in his early 30s and doesn't have that depth of experience?
Well, I think one of the things that I found over and over and over again, what people overlook are fundamentals. And all of my programs, all of my writing has been based on the fundamentals. And I write to the C student. Bill Nye and I had dinner one night at the university where my wife was teaching. And I didn't tell him what I did, but I was kind of quizzing him what he did. And I just saw him perform. And I said, Bill, I said, what's your audience? Who do you write to? What do you develop? He said, he says, I go to third grade level and I demonstrate in simple concepts, but 80% of my audience are adults. And that just registered with me. I said, that's what I've always done. I've written to the C student because that's the average. That's most of your kids. That's most of your adults. And therefore, keep the story simple, teach the fundamentals. And particularly if you're selling something, if you're going into a new technology, get those fundamentals down. Because if you don't have a good foundation, the rest of it, you'll end up with gaps and you'll make mistakes. But if you understand your fundamentals and always come back to that, you'll usually have a very successful operation.
So does that apply also in business and in other things as well, or is it mostly something that is that is operative primarily in technology?
No, I think it's a real model for business, because when I looked at new companies or I looked at buying some equipment, I wanted to know, what does it do for me? Okay. What are the fundamental pieces that are going to make me successful or makes the company successful? And if you understand those fundamentals, in many cases, it's a key person, someone who has the passion and vision to make that company work. If you don't have that, you're going to end up what I would just call an average company, that unless the market is really strong and you can survive, you're not going anywhere.
It's interesting that you say that the fundamentals could even be just a person who has vision. I'm not a venture capitalist or an angel investor or anything like that, but I do work with startups, and I've begun to try to develop a sense for when a person has vision or when they're just charismatic and they're full of bullshit and good at talking. So do you have any advice for delineating between those two categories of people?
Yeah, if they cannot explain the core values or the core concepts of what their fundamentals will take them to the next level. Whether it's, I've worked with the first LED light bulbs. Okay, there was a lot of misunderstanding about what they could do. Once they focused their energy on the fundamentals of the light and getting it out there and the energy savings and that, then they could expand on it. The CNC machines were, what could you do? CAD was another real good example. I was involved in developing the first educational system for Autocad back in the 80s. Autocad had the fundamentals of drawing down and using the computer. It was one of the few companies that changed industry. In other words, education changed industry. It's usually the other way around. Industry changes education. But here was people coming out of the schools with a CAD background. They went into a drafting department, and within 2 years, 80% of the drafting tables were gone, and 6 computers had replaced them all.
Interesting.
So, but again, with crypto, with whatever technology you're dealing with, what is the long range that you can build on your fundamentals? Is it the value? Is it the control of a market? What is your core, and develop that core?
That strikes me as one of those ideas that's very elegant and simple to state, but that can actually be kind of hard to do. But I like the litmus test of just asking a person, explain to me at a C student level what this does and what the value for me is. I think that's a very useful lens to take with you into a field where you're often dealing with people whose professional portfolio is built around tricking people out of their money.
Right. Well, I'm dealing with one with the algorithm, and it worked with dissemination of information and and basically it was doing surveying. And they said, well, help me understand what you're doing. And finally, after I got down to the level of the engineers, they said, well, we can go measure this and a lot more precisely. I said, well, that's great, but what does that do for me?
Right.
He said, well, if you were measuring it the old way and new way, we're 30% more accurate, so you don't need to move 27 tons or 27 trucks of dirt. Oh, okay.
Well, that sounds great.
27, that's at $500 a truck. I've just found out why I want to work with you.
Yeah, no kidding. So how do you feel about projects that don't have a clear goal in mind, that are just primarily exploratory? Because you often find advances in technology and in science which are driven by tinkering. And if you were to apply this test to Michael Faraday, maybe in the 19th century, or what, I guess 17th century, whenever it was, why he was doing it, or to explain it at a third grade level, I suspect he'd have a hard time really capturing his motivations. So how do you separate things that are primarily driven by business and where it's important to get to the fundamentals, and things that are driven primarily by curiosity where it's less important to explain in clear terms what you're doing?
Well, I mean, there's a matter of trying to have a certain level of vision and activity. I was on a cruise ship talking to a gentleman, and he said they came with this product and I couldn't see any value in it. And he said, it's doing pretty well now, this Velcro stuff.
Well, so, you get lots of examples like that. I think it was William Röntgen who discovered the X-ray, and he was asked what practical applications there would be for it, and he said none. He just had no idea what you would do with this technology, and yet, we all know how valuable that's proven to be. So it's not really that unusual in the history of technology to be in that situation where it's not clear what you're going to do with it.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned the history of technology, because that's the other essence of what I do in my books. If you look at each one looks at what the other did, the other looks at someone else is doing, and a lot of times that part that you are missing is what the other person has.
Right.
In other words, the Velcro didn't mean anything to him, but when a guy in clothing said, hey, that would really be great for people who can't button. So now somebody with a special need saw a value in it. Once that value was established, Velcro became important to that person, And then other people say, oh, if you could use it for that, maybe I could use it for my shoes. Maybe I could use it for that. So I think sometimes what you have to do is step back and try to figure out why is your piece unique, and where is the partnership, or where is the sequence that will help you take that, if that's where you're headed. If you're just a tinkerer, it really doesn't matter.
Now, we've spent a fair bit of time on the history of technology and principles that can be gleaned from your experience with it. You also mentioned that you have written about how tech is evolving, how it will evolve in the future, and that in a number of cases you've been prescient with respect to what was coming next, specifically automation and that sort of thing. So I don't know how much attention you pay to technology today, but do you have any predictions as to the way something like quantum computing or cryptocurrency is going to evolve?
Not so much in the financial world, but because I've worked with industrial automation, the one thing that I sold the IBEW on back 30 years ago was the idea that what do they do for a living? And they control heat, light, temperature, pressure. And both in industrial automation and in my book on smart home, it's based on sensors and the ability to measure your environment, whether it's, and then now they're getting into taste and smell, anything that replicates the human ability to touch or feel. We're adding AI to that to give it some intelligence, but there's always an output. So almost all industrial automation, almost all smart home technology is based on input, process, output.
Right.
You push the doorbell, a signal goes out, turns on the ding dong.
Mm-hmm.
But now cryptocurrency, that's kind of fascinating from the standpoint, will that be controlled by the people who are evolving that, or is that a government regulation? And my fear would be in the crypto is, will the governments try to control it, close it, administer it, or will it have its life of its own? And that to me is the unknown. And if I studied it a little bit more, maybe I'd know a little bit more, but that would be my concern. Where is it going for the potential of a worldwide currency versus a currency here or there?
Yeah.
Maybe you can enlighten us, since that's your area of expertise.
Yeah, I've worked more on the technology and less on the policy, but I've been turning more and more of my attention towards policy considerations and what might be required for a Bitcoin standard, whether or not it's even feasible, could it ever unseat the dollar? And actually, we've done a number of interviews recently with monetary economists like George Selgin. We interviewed famed analyst Lynn Alden and a number of other folks picking their brains about this. I really don't have a clear picture on it yet. I think that there is the possibility for crypto to grow much larger than it is now and to take over a far larger fraction of payments processing, of remittances, of storing and guarding value over time. But we are very much at a turning point, I think, right now, and in particular with what's going on around the sanctions on Russia and the potential for these oligarchs to evade sanctions by storing their wealth offshore in a crypto fund somewhere, and the legislative backlash that you've seen, particularly among certain American politicians. And there have been a number of recent developments on that front. So Biden issued his executive order, and that was not nearly as that was not bad news in the way that many people feared that it would be. But I think it's very much an open question as to what the role of the government will be going forward, whether or not they will regulate it to death. And there is obviously the potential that they will. It seems to me like, I didn't follow it super closely, but the EU recently held a vote on legislation that might have banned proof of work, which is the consensus algorithm that underlies Bitcoin, and proof of stake is what underlies Ethereum now. So you've got a couple of different ways of doing this, and they wound up not banning proof of work, but that's exactly the kind of ham-fisted thing that you could see come out of a major power like the United States or the European Union that could drive innovation elsewhere and close us out of the future of the cryptocurrency future. So I really don't have strong predictions on it just yet. I'm watching the situation and thinking a lot about it, but obviously, like everyone else, I hope that we are able to regulate it sensibly in ways that cuts down on crime, but that does not stifle innovation. And that's a somewhat pat answer, but that's where I'm at right now.
Well, I think the internet's another example. It's prolific, but at the same time, you look across nations, they can stop it, they can control it, they can do a lot of things with the internet that its initial purpose is, it's changing it. Let's put it that way.
Right. It's unfortunately the case that these new technologies that are going to open up an entire new frontier of free human activity and break the shackles of oppressive states, it often just does not end up quite working out that way, unfortunately.
So, yeah. But I think, what is interesting, I just did a speaking engagement with Must, which is an international company, and we were talking about a variety of subjects. And innovation is going to come, but right now, one of the things that are holding it back are silos. And I use that term because although you have innovation, a lot of times, and particularly in the smart home technology area, a lot of companies are being held back by silos. And by that, I mean that you had a lot of innovators, the doorbell, the voice commands, this, that, and now they're being sucked up by the big companies. Well, those individuals who were innovative are now part of a large company. They're kind of protecting their environment, and they're not necessarily looking at what other companies have been absorbed in their company. So until they begin to integrate, like Musk has done and some of the other people who have been innovative, the silo can hold you back. And my book, again, I'm promoting that. It's all about all the fundamentals of a smart home, so that you can see how energy ties into the appliances, how it ties into your home management, how, for example, I use the vacuum. That vacuum today has some artificial intelligence, and it does your rug. But there's no reason why you can take that technology and with gaming and put a little security camera on it or a filter, and when it's not vacuuming and you're out of town, you could manipulate that, send it into a room, and have it look at what's going on. Also, wheelchairs, if you take that same technology and like that you have in driving cars, and someone in a wheelchair says, take me to the kitchen, as compared to them trying to motivate on their own. So I'm pretty excited about what's going to happen when these silos break down and there's cooperative effort with everyone.
Yeah, I am as well. And we're going to get to smart homes and the Internet of Things in just a moment. But I want to stick with this question of silos. And I agree that they have a tendency to add a lot of friction in the innovative process, in the process of innovation, rather. And I just wonder what it is that drives that. And given that you've got such a broad perspective on the history and the future of technology, I imagine you've given some thought to this question. So why is it that these silos tend to develop, where you've got technologies that don't interoperate, where you've got small companies that are vacuumed up by big companies and they become kind of stagnant? I mean, some of that is, healthy. I mean, you want to guard trade secrets, you want to guard your IP, and it's perfectly reasonable that a company like Amazon might be buying up quantum computing startups or what have you. But if it's stifling innovation, that's problematic. And so I wonder if you've got any insight into what's driving that and the best ways of getting around it.
Well, there's a couple of things. The one that's most common, the fact that when you have your secrets and you have your area, you want to protect it. It's just human nature to not give away too much so that you don't lose your job.
Right.
Number two, if you're innovative and you're doing some things in the company that's pretty neat, that gets the attention of the CEO. Maybe you're motivated toward moving up. So what has to happen is focus on the customer, because if the customer, that's where you'll see where silos really have the effect. Because I call in, I want to get something done. Well, I don't know anything about that. I think somebody over in such and such can do that. Well, you should be able to call customer service and say, yes, I understand your problem. Let me get you in touch with Joe over in such and such. They should have enough knowledge to be able to get that processed. So I tell them, and what I've seen from everyone else is if you focus on the customer, when they call in and they can get the information they need, you probably have broken down a lot of the silos.
Yeah, I agree. I think that's a compelling answer. The only thing I worry about is that the problem of aggregating that knowledge and putting it into the minds of customer service personnel may end up just being a more difficult problem than you think. So I don't know if are aware of this development, but there's this new job title, Chief Knowledge Officer. And there aren't very many of these people, but they're folks who think about the problems we're discussing right now, siloing information that's in the head of exactly one person. And if that person were to be hit by a car, the company would grind to a halt for a couple of weeks. Like, knowledge management is a trickier obstacle to furthering a company's goals than I think a lot of people appreciate. And I don't really have a smart answer to that. It's just putting it out there as an observation.
The next level is your marketing department, marketing and sales. If they're truly going to represent the company's total answer,
they got to know.
They should know, and that's multiple people. They also should document it so that their salespeople will understand it. And if their salespeople understand it, then they should be able to transfer that down to customer service. And they need to have some cooperative activities between those three agencies, and that will help. You can go back into engineering and do a whole different series, but if you take sales and marketing and the customer service, that knowledge should be there if the company is successful. You don't have to have in depth, and again, I keep coming back to my book. That's why I gave the fundamentals of smart home at a basic level. How do the transmitters work? How do the energy management work? How does the plumbing work? Just fundamentals. Now, if you want more depth, I say go into the internet and research that area. And the customer service can be the same thing. I know Joe does that. Go to his department. Here's the number. You don't have to have a real deep knowledge of the problem. You need to find out where the solution lies.
Yeah, so it seems sort of trivial to state it this way, but it's almost as if the silos in knowledge, just breaking down the silos in knowledge has to begin with breaking down the silos in communication. People have to feel okay to talk to each other. It has to be an accepted practice for somebody from sales or marketing to sit in on an engineering call or go to the team and talk to them about that. And you are able to disseminate that information in a way that percolates out to ultimately the end users who are calling in the first place. And it seems like the ball needs to be set in motion by someone like me. I'm a director of communications now. And so a lot of this has been on my mind. That's actually a really useful way of thinking about it.
When I went to the building show recently, sales and marketing brought their salesmen in from all over the net so they could see what the company did. Now, that was a very expensive process to pull the heads of departments from all over the country and fly them in, pay all their expenses and that, when they could put together some courses that teach the fundamentals of what my company does with examples, not theory, but real simple. Here's what we do. Here's how the push button works. Da 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 da. Here's how it ties into a home. Give them examples that they could be proud of and excited about to talk about.
Okay. Yeah, that's excellent. Yeah. Illustrative materials or teaching materials that people use. I mean, what we do at the company I'm at now and at a few companies I've been at are lunch and learns. If you've heard of these, where it's essentially just a lecture, that somebody gives at lunch. So I recently did one on what the blockchain is and how it works. And we're a blockchain analytics company, and so we have really, really smart people. But a lot of the folks in sales or the strategy people just had never taken a really careful, really granular look at how a transaction is put together and what it means exactly to mine a block. Like they were operating kind of on metaphors and sort of a sort of vague grasp of these things. And I felt almost a little silly putting it together, but the feedback was really, really good. They really enjoyed it and they got a lot out of it. And I think that in light of what you've said, that all makes a lot more sense. It's important to get to the fundamentals and understand the stack from the bottom to the top, even if not in a lot of detail, if you're going to do a good job.
Well, I'll give you one example I use with my company. I would go out and people say, how come I can't get that equipment faster? I said, I don't know. He said, well, I sent a purchase order in and it seems like it was weeks before I even got a response. So what I did, I put all my people around a round table and I said, I've got a purchase order. Tell me how you process it. Well, Mary opens the mail and then she goes over and makes 3 copies. Why do you make 3 copies? Well, Jane over here wants 1 copy, such and such wants 1 copy, and the other one goes over here. Why? Well, pretty soon I found out that we were making all kinds of copies just for CYA, and there was no reason for it. So we streamlined that and went from 2 weeks down to 3 days.
That's another thing, legibility into the process. And this isn't an issue, at any of the startups I've been at because there's like 12 people. But for a bigger company, over time, as people are solving problems, they just develop these little systems and these little workarounds and these habits and these expectations. And that's all perfectly fine if it's working well, but it over time can gradually become a problem, and nobody really exactly knows why, because it's a complex system with many different moving parts, and it's difficult just to peer down into it and say, okay, well, why is she making 30? Why are 30 copies coming out of this at various points in the process? And it's not like anybody sat down and said, we're going to make 30 copies of every single document that comes through here. It's just one person asked and another person asked. And over time, it kind of built up into this cruft that is clogging up the functioning of the organism, the machine that is the business. So that's very interesting. I appreciate that as an example.
Well, there's a very simple story, if you don't mind a quick joke. And it's a young lady goes to her mom and says, hey, I've got my boyfriend coming over tomorrow night, and I'd like to make him one of those hams that Grandma makes. It's really, really good. Can you show me how to do that? And the mother said, I'm sorry, I got a meeting coming up tomorrow night, but why don't you go and talk to Grandma? She'll be more than happy to spend some time with you. So he goes over there. She goes over there and talks to the grandmother, and grandmother's, oh yeah, here, you take this, you take that, mix it all up, and blah, blah, blah. That's a great coating. And then you cut the ends off and you put it in the pot. Oh, the girl said, that's what my mom was always wondering. Why do you cut the ends off? She says, I don't know why she does. I do because I only got a pot this big. Maybe you've heard that story before.
I've heard similar stories. It's a similar paradigm, right? Where somebody starts doing something and that's passed on as wisdom, or people just observe it and they carry it with them forward, and they don't really understand the reasons why. But when you're just looking at a recipe, when you're looking at like a medicine or something like that, or a process for healing or teaching, it's really difficult to know which are the steps that are essential and which are the ones that are not. And so people tend to just grab them wholesale and carry them forward without really understanding how the different parts work.
I think the other thing that is very important, and sometimes companies think it's too expensive, but you can do it less expensively than going off to a resort, and that's to have a 1 or 2 day retreat, even within the company, and to bring what I would do once a year. I'd bring in all my people, and we'd take a weekend, and we would have meetings where sales, marketing, and accounting and would meet, and then they'd rotate. And into each case, they were to bring their complaints. Not with the idea of being mean, but just saying, hey, why do you do this? And they started going back and forth. And then at the end, as the CEO, I'd say, okay, what are your problems? Let's talk about it now, because we can solve it now. You're going to go back into the field. Let's pick 2 items. Let's work on them. And we do that every year. And pretty soon we had a pretty streamlined operation.
I like that. I'm going to take that with me as the company grows. But we probably should spend some time on your new book, because that's, after all, the reason that you wanted to come on in the first place. So you mentioned it a couple of different times. You've mentioned it's about smart homes. So why don't you start from the top? Tell us what it is, what its title is, and what its purpose is.
Well, there's all kinds of definitions of a smart home. But I want to explain to people starting off, they go, well, I don't want a smart home. I don't see any reason for it. I said, well, then you probably want to throw away your garage door opener. You probably want to get rid of your remote on your TV. You already have a smart home from the standpoint that you're using some technology to make things more comfortable or convenient for you. If you want to add to that comfort, convenience, or security, then start researching what else you can do to make your life better. And after COVID, and you've had to spend a lot of time in that home, you ought to have some pretty good ideas what that is. And in my book, what I do is, instead of writing about it, I have QR codes. And I say, you want to see what a smart bedroom looks like? You take your phone, you put it over the page QR code, and on your phone comes alive, and I take you through a tour of a smart bedroom. And then I take you through a tour of a smart kitchen. And I take you through a tour of a smart living room, and say to you, here's what you could do. What do you want to do? And have a checklist. And for example, in the smart bedroom, I talk about the fact that what if you have a child who's deaf or blind and there's a fire? Why not have maybe a vibrating pillow? Let's have a color red or blue or green that tells what's an intruder or someone that there's a fire going on. There's doors that you can open and close. There's pill dispensers. There's a lot of things that could add to your convenience and comfort.
Right.
You think about it, and then you'll begin to see that a smart home is based on the idea of having convenience, comfort, and now that they're using peace of mind rather than security, because security sounds a little too tough.
Right.
And then that's the basis for it. Again, going back to the fundamentals, and then I explain how a transmitter receiver works. You hold one in your hand every day. It's called a phone. and you can do commands by push button, which you text. You can do by voice and contact or control stuff. So what I do is just try to take you through and understand how and what is working. Why can a refrigerator do what it does? Why can Bluetooth get you to go here or do that with a command? And again, go back to the idea, everything in it is input, processor, control. And when you look around, whether it's your TV, you push a button, there's a signal sent out, and your TV turns on. Almost everything else in the house operates like that, with the exception of those things that you add artificial intelligence, like the thermostat. Its primary goal is to turn on and off your furnace or your air conditioner. However, you can add intelligence to it to determine certain things that you always do that it will do for you. So smart home is, again, for comfort, convenience, and peace of mind or security.
It occurs to me that we have an interesting definitional question here, and this is probably one of those questions that gets really tedious after a while, so I apologize if that's the case, but you're correct in pointing out that garage door openers are a kind of primitive smart application in a home, or that a thermostat is a primitive smart application in a home. To me, it's not really a smart home until you have some measure of artificial intelligence. So I'm just curious as to how you define a smart home, because it's clearly pointing at a distinct kind of domicile, but I don't know where you draw that line or where you would consider yourself to be living in a smart home.
Well, and that's where I think people get a distortion. It is getting so commonplace to have certain fundamentals that the building industry now puts a core of certain items in, like a security system, like a thermostat, leak detector, and they call it a home. Just like you would have switches and light bulbs and a furnace, it is becoming more commonplace that a smart home is one that has the fundamentals of what I just said. Now, if you want to go to another level where you go beyond just comfort and other areas where you want a lot of little tricks in lighting, turning on and off, you want certain things to happen when you walk in or drive out, that's at a different level. And it's probably a smaller marketplace, maybe 5 to 10% of the people that really want that, because they have to have the technical background to adjust and fix it. Unless they have the technical support, which again, usually is in the upper income, to be able to keep that operational.
Right.
So the good news, though, is there's a new movement out called Matter. Are you familiar with that?
I've never heard of it, no.
Well, Matter, there's a movement now, and the large companies, or even Apple, are getting involved, and they're going to come out with a common language for all smart devices.
Oh, this is great.
Right. It's been one of the things that have held back the industry.
The silos.
Yeah, because there's too many. Well, and I write about it in my book about how you got this one language, you got that language, this won't talk to that, you got to have this. So it's going to really clean it up. It won't be here, right? They'll do a few companies and a few devices, but you can expect, if you're looking at the future of smart homes, of that to become more commonplace. You'll be able to go down and buy a device, plug it in, and get the expectation out of it right away. So that will clean up the definition of a smart home, unless you want to go above and beyond, the Bill Gates' houses and things like that, where, the TV turns into an aquarium and 3D models come out of the woodwork. And and I think it has been oversold from that perspective, that it's far more complicated than it really is. But it all boils down to, what do you want in your home to make it comfortable, convenient, and safe? And when you reach that, you've reached your level of what a smart home is.
I see. So partly because of hype or maybe too much marketing, people have this vision in their mind of a smart home being a really smart home that really does a lot of stuff for you, when in fact it could just be devices that talk to each other in a way that solves some relatively minor problem for you, or helps, in the case that you alluded to earlier of a special needs child or person with some kind of disability, in making their life easier, and that the technical lift required may not really be that big a deal. Do I have that right?
Right. And I think the old idea that, and this is dating me, but Hal, the computer, Hal, what's going on? I can't have access to that anymore. No, that I think is a little science fiction. Although if you buy a variety of devices that can't talk to each other, you'll feel that way.
Yeah, absolutely. Or if they start to malfunction in strange ways, like one part of it drops out, or they get into some kind of weird feedback loop, and so the TV is yelling at the blender and it's turning on for no reason at all, and you just have no idea where a breakdown occurred in the process and no idea of how to fix it.
Yeah, and I said the biggest word in my book is interoperability, and I tried to define that, because I said the biggest word I know is delicatessen. And actually, people that don't know what that is either.
Delicatessen?
Yeah. I was really surprised. The younger groups, and I said, deli. Oh, I think I know what that is. But, again, getting the vocabulary so you can have the ability to talk to somebody about it will bring some clarity. Because if you walk into any technology, if you don't have the background of basics, and again, I go back to the fundamentals, and the salesmen, the technicians that are putting this stuff in, they need to be able to talk about fundamentals to the customer.
Right.
And I keep focusing on the customer because ultimately that's why you're in business, is to serve the customer that has the money to buy your product. If they don't understand it and they don't need it, you're not going to sell them anything.
Yeah, absolutely. Can you tell me a little bit about the state of smart homes today and what you see the near-term future being like?
Well, it's growing, and there are certain segments of the market that are growing faster than others. I think just because it's easy to sell, security like ADT and others, they're promoting the heck out of it. So you think you need it first, but there's also the thermostat is being pushed. So right now, smart home is being driven by silos of marketing, and people are experimenting with other parts, or they're going with a company. So I'm going to be an app, or I'm going to be Lexus, or I'm going to be this, in hopes that they can monitor and use the equipment more efficiently. So, but once Matter takes over, that's going to have a significant impact on the purchasing of this equipment, and hopefully the complexity will go away, and more of the applications will be brought to bear, if you know what I mean.
Oh, no, 100%. When you reduce friction in the process of bringing a device or an application or a piece of software to market, then you get more of it done, obviously. And so if they can talk to each other and you don't have to come up with some complex API or handshaking protocol, that just streamlines the whole thing. I mean, I would argue it's no different than using a GUI or a programming environment or something like that. You make it much easier. People get a lot more work done.
Well, and another segment that's growing very, very strongly is my age group. I'm 75. So I'm looking at what am I going to need in terms of faucets that turn on and off,
right?
Access to the home that will make my life living in place more efficient and less dependent on other people.
Right.
And I've taken 4 parents or relatives from poor health to death, and I've seen certain technologies that weren't developed at the time that I could have used that would have made my life in communicating with them and managing them much better.
What are some examples? And you don't have to focus specifically on end-of-life care. That's a somewhat macabre subject. But just in general, what are the amenities, the smart amenities that you hope to see or are currently seeing or are very excited about? Just take that question however you like it.
Well, I think one of the things that we've seen really evolve is the wheelchair.
Okay.
And being able to comfortably move around, being able to maneuver in small places. Like I said, I think once AI has been accepted in the cars, I don't see any reason why it couldn't be adapted to a wheelchair, because once you're in your home and there's all the obstacles have been taken out of the way, there's no reason you can't say, take me to the kitchen. And if I have issues with my arms that make me difficult to maneuver it by hand, it will take me automatically to the kitchen. I also see pill dispensing and making sure that you take the right dosage. That can be programmed in,
right,
either to verbally tell you, or in the case of caregivers, there's little compartments that will come out. Your dog, when you leave, there are literally playmates. There are dispensers that say, "Best mister, come on over, time for chow." And it'll open up, it'll give them water. Just things that will just make it easier. You can't bend over to do some things, but your caregiver or your relative comes in, fills the dispenser, and the dog that you love is now being taken care of in ways that you hadn't thought.
I like that. I like that answer a lot. And there's a pretty clear connection, I think, to smart homes and the Internet of Things. And I know that's a subject you've given some thought as well. So how do you see these two trends converging or these two silos interfacing?
Well, I'm not sure that they're silos as much as I see the Internet of Things. Well, I guess from the Internet of Things, I think of it as the communication network. I think of it as the Internet, which is the connectivity. For the outside world, again, there's one example that they have found with Alzheimer's patients that avatars work very well, and that they create avatars where someone remotely can call, wake up the person. It comes to their bed and says, "Ralph, wake up." And it can be a dog, it can be a person, it could be, but it's non-intimidating. And they find that they communicate with these folks. So that's a good example of the Internet of Things. I think making reservations and or doctor's appointments, I think those will become more automated and better. You'll get feedback. I'm already getting them now. Are you coming to your appointment?
Yeah.
Now, where it's going to be interesting is to see, they're talking about airports, that as more and more of these cars become self-driving, that the airports will diminish as parking lots, and they will become storage units for cars that will go pick you up and bring you to the airport.
Right.
So the imagination is going to go forward. But again, what does it come back to? It's convenience, something that you need. Well,
making life better.
Making life better. And so I think that's where the Internet of Things will meld into your home environment. Because when you leave, where are you going? To the grocery store? Now they say, well, you can look at your phone and it'll tell you what's in your refrigerator. And you can see, oh, yeah, I have a half a gallon of milk. I need that. I didn't get my list quite complete before I ran out the door. So imagination is going to take you to where you find solutions that maybe you hadn't thought about before.
And I want to broaden it just a bit more to encompass smart cities. So I'm reading a book now called Blockchain Revolution, which says that Singapore is trying to become one of the first smart nations. So how do you think that the Internet of Things and smart homes could gradually scale to include things like managing the power grid or directing traffic in a way that's less awful?
Well, I was going to write a book on the smart grid, so I know a little bit about that. And microgrids seem to be one of the movements, whether the microgrid is your home, based on if you want to be off the grid with a solar panel, less likely to be a wind generator. And so you will be a mini micro, but you can also take your storage and tie it into the community, into a more of a macro microgrid, which then the town, in the case of an emergency, can power their own the areas of the community. And so that's one of the areas that is developing, is the energy grid and trying to use storage. Also talking about where there's large buildings where people go to work, if the battery storage in the cars are sufficient and are tied in, they could, in a case of a short term, actually use the battery power to be converted into a power source to run part of the emergency lighting or some nature. In terms of traffic, I think it was San Diego, one of the places I visited recently, now has in your car, it will tell you when the stoplight's coming up and when how long it's going to be on before you go to your next level. They're also monitoring with cameras the amount of cars and traffic in a certain lane, and depending on that allows the green light to stay open longer so the traffic flows better. Lighting, of course, in the past has been tied into photocells. Now they're looking at managing the sun and how much light comes at certain times in the day, and when the street lights go on, when they go off. So they're managing the energy within the city itself. So yeah, there's a lot of things that are going to be happening in the cities and in the homes and tying them together.
Very interesting. Very interesting. And then how big a concern is security for all of these applications? Because clearly if you've got the grid under automated control or semi-automated control, or people's homes are making decisions for them, that's a pretty obvious place for an attacker to target. So do you think security will have to scale as well, or is it mostly just a matter of following basic common sense guidelines?
Boy, I wish I had the answer to that. I'd probably make millions, billions possibly. You watch science fiction, it seems like no matter how elaborate the security system, there's always somebody that figures out how to break it.
There's always a way in.
So I think the idea is to stay poor and not have a lot of stuff that people want.
Well, assuming that we're not going to do that, right?
No, I think, the biggest issue with security is not staying up with it. In other words, you get lazy.
Right.
You leave your door open in your house. Somebody comes by and sees the door open. You see a garage door open. I think the security and protocol that come with a lot of pieces of equipment, they talk about you get your modem and they never change the password. So
right.
A lot of it has to do with individual responsibility. And if that's not the case, then they should give you a better way in which you can, like you would monitor the water in your home, or you can monitor the level of your security password, something that would monitor your security codes or whatever it might be to make sure that you have in fact reached that level of maximum security for what you're paying.
Right.
And I also believe, and I learned after being in Israel, and also being in other places, that it surprised me at the airport. I didn't see the level of security that I saw at O'Hare Airport.
Right.
And I basically said, why is that? And they said, well, if you wait until they get in the airport to start your security, you've got an issue because it's almost too late.
Right.
Now, they do have gun racks and that underneath the people that are checking you in, but you don't know that. But what I also learned, and I put in the book, you should have perimeter security outside your home. The sooner you can determine that there is a problem, the longer you have to make a reasonable response. And most of the problems with burglary or someone hacking or whatever is the fact that you have a knee-jerk reaction, which probably is not good. So if you have more time to respond, you will make a better decision, or you will have in place something that will allow you to countermeasure whatever it is that's coming at you.
Of course. Well, do you have any final thoughts you want to leave us with as we wrap up here?
Oh.
The one question you weren't prepared for.
It is. Well, I think from my perspective, the biggest thing that people need to do is ask the question, what will it do for me? How easy is it to put in place? And what are my long-term benefits? Do I really need it? And if you do, then do the research and figure out what it is that you want, and then go to the process of making it happen. And I think whether you're buying a refrigerator or you're a car or new clothing or whatever, find out, ask the questions, and make a good decision.
Well, I love that. That's wisdom from decades and decades in science, technology, and industry. Thanks so much, Gary.
You're more than welcome. Thank you.